In the island nation of the Comoros, between Madagascar and the African mainland, the government was overthrown in a coup staged by Robert Bob Denard, a former French Navy sailor who'd spent much of his career since the end of the Algerian War as a mercenary in Africa, sometimes doing jobs for the French government when they wanted to do something anti-communist but deniable. He'd fought as a mercenary in Katanga, a breakaway province of Congo, in the 60s, then Portuguese Angola, Yemen, back to Katanga again, Biafra, Rhodesia and Iran before winding up in the Comoros, which was strategically important as a supply base for the ongoing conflict in Mozambique, as well as embargo-breaking trade to South Africa. From 1978 to 1989, Denard was effectively president of the Comoros, ruling via the puppet he installed, before being removed in turn by the country's 20th coup since its independence in 1975. Kicked out of the country, Denard returned in late September 1995 with a small group in Zodiac boats to have another go, but this time the world situation had changed and so had the French government, and the French army assisted the Comorians in arresting Denard on the condition that rather than going on trial in Moroni, he would accompany them back to Paris to answer a few questions. In amongst all his mercenary activity, Denard had found time to marry 7 times, some of them simultaneously and therefore bigamously, and father 8 children. Trials went on for many, many years, and he was finally sentenced in 2006, by which time he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease and died the following year. He was the subject of a French biopic, Mr. Bob, in 2011. And on race day itself, Louis Meyer passed away at the age of 91. Meyer had been a pioneering racing driver in his native US in the 1920s, winning the Indianapolis 500 in 1928, in not only his first year, but the first year the track was owned by World War I fighter ace Eddie Rickenbacker. He repeated the win in 1933 and 36, the latter from 28th on the grid, the second row from the back. It had been a hot day, and Meyer remembered something he'd been taught by his mum and asked for a glass of buttermilk, which is often credited with beginning the tradition of the Indy winner being given a bottle of milk to drink, though in the post-war years the winner was actually given a bucket of ice water, called Water from Wilbur, the Speedway president and former winner Wilbur Shaw, and it wasn't until 1956, and a marketing push from the dairies, that the tradition stuck. As well as his 3 Indy wins, Louis Meyer won the AAA Championship 3 times, in 1928, 29 and 33, as well as proving a dirt track ace, as many events on paved circuits were hit by the Great Depression. With just a week between races, the F1 teams had packed up, driven the thick end of 2,500 kilometres, a bit over 1,500 miles, and unpacked again, though the 40 Corsi squad really couldn't catch a break. Their motorhome broke down in Salamanca, and then their F3000 truck broke its gearbox near Como on the way back to HQ. A new motorhome was hurriedly rented, only for that one to crack its suspension in Belgium. Finally, Guido Forti was able to arrange for one of the Peugeot motorhomes to come out from the Nürburgring and get his beleaguered team, delivering the exhausted boys in yellow to the track on Thursday night, thus missing the extra familiarisation session that had been arranged since the track hadn't been used for Formula One in nearly a decade. It was time for more of the final pieces of the 1996 drivers' puzzle to be slotted into place. To no great surprise, McLaren announced that their driver lineup would be Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard, the Scot fresh off his first win and hoping to match Johnny Herbert in repeating the feat before the end of the season, and with no great reason to be a Williams team player anymore. What was more of a surprise was Ferrari's announcement that Michael Schumacher's teammate for 1996 would be Eddie Irvine. During all the furious speculation about who would get the nod, the Ulsterman hadn't really been mentioned, and the choice left a lot of people scratching their heads. Eddie's reputation didn't suggest either that he'd be happy to give way to Schumacher on track, nor that he'd be a more polished PR performer than the outgoing Alesi, and his reputation as an irreverent party animal and womaniser might have appealed to the fans, but how would it play with the corporate suits in Turin and their paymasters at Marlborough and Shell? The boy could drive, nobody doubted that, of course, but the Tifosi didn't even need particularly long memories to recall Ivan Capelli, a talented driver recruited from a small, fun-loving British-based team and brought into the high-pressure political environment of the Scuderia, and how well that had gone. Perhaps that was why Eddie had been signed just for a single year, but with the option to extend 2 more. There was one small problem in that Irvine had just signed a contract extension with Eddie Jordan, but that was nothing a cool $5 million couldn't fix, which would help EJ immensely in the search for a replacement. Indeed, it's entirely possible that Irvine signed the contract in the full knowledge that he'd be moving precisely in order to arrange a parting gift for the man who'd given him his break. That's me speculating, by the way. In any case, the search was not a long one. Martin Brundle would be Rubens Barrichello's new teammate. As EJ reminded everyone, all the way back in 1983, when Martin had been duelling with Ayrton Senna for the British Formula 3 title, he'd been doing it at the wheel of an Eddie Jordan Racing Ralt Toyota, making Martin, as Eddie put it, the first Jordan driver to race in F1. All of this was done without the knowledge of Peugeot, to the annoyance of Jean-Pierre Jabouille, who had been hoping to give an opportunity to a young French driver like Laurent Aiello, but while he didn't appreciate Eddie going behind his back, he wasn't complaining about the result. Brundle was experienced, quick, and he'd worked with Jabouille and Peugeot before at McLaren. Ligier, now looking for a replacement for Brundle, had set up a test with Jos Verstappen, who was of course not unknown to Tom Walkinshaw, and who'd had a decent few races with the Simtech team before they folded. Back at Ferrari, Todt, Montezemolo and Jean Alesi had hashed things out, in private for once, and Jean had been issued with a whopping $200,000 fine for disobeying team orders in the race. Jean is currently experiencing some personal issues, said Todt. He is unhappy about leaving Ferrari, and went on to say essentially that the matter was now closed. Closed it may have been, but Alesi looked like he was chewing a wasp all weekend. With Ukio Katayama following the doctor's advice to have a week off after his colossal shunt at Estoril 4 days earlier, Ken Tyrrell offered the seat to his test driver Gabriele Tarquini, and the team did have time to replace the red disc behind Katayama's number 3 on the nose with the Italian tricolore. Car 3, Gabriele Tarquini. Tarquini holds the unenviable F1 record of being the driver with the most failures to pre-qualify against his record, 25, out of a total of 40 failures to qualify in general, which was thanks to spending the late 80s and early 90s bouncing around a series of underfunded back-of-the-grid teams, Coloni, AGS and Fondmetal. It was for the second of these that he scored his only point, for 6th place at the 1989 Mexican Grand Prix, from a very respectable 17th on the grid, and indeed his equipment may not have been up to much, but he usually outshone whichever teammate he had in whatever car he was given, and occasionally made the 1992 Fondmetal look half decent before it inevitably broke down. As well as Formula 1, he'd spent 1992 driving an Italian Superturismo, driving a BMW M3 for the private CBM team, alongside Emanuele Pirro, scoring consistently enough to come 5th overall. With Fondmetal collapsing at the end of the year, he was offered a contract with Alfa Romeo for a full-time berth, driving a third Works 155TS, registered to the Fiat Auto France team, with the main Alfa Corsa team running Gianni Morbidelli and Tamara Vidali. 5 wins and 4 seconds was enough to see him finish 3rd overall and above both of the main team's drivers. When, in 1994, Alfa Romeo decided to enter the prestigious British Touring Car Championship, it was Tarquini who would make the trip with them. The Alfas were dominant right out of the box, with Gabriele winning the first 5 races on the trot before several other teams protested their use of aerodynamics, and then copied them when the team were reinstated, but while the racing in the second half of the season was closer, Tarquini was able to clinch the title at the penultimate round. With their point proven, Alfa returned to Superturismo, leaving their BTCC team in the hands of David Richards' ProDrive, and Tarquini's title defence was something of a disaster. But his Italian connections at Fondmetal, which still existed as a company, it was just the racing team that had collapsed, had got him a testing berth with Ken Tyrrell, a job he was great at, and at 33 he was pretty clear that his time in F1 was over. "I'm here 80% for the enjoyment, the other 20% is a dream," he told French magazine Auto Hebdo. Williams had flown out enough spares that they once again had 2 FW17Bs available, though the spare car was still the older A, while McLaren had a new hybrid car, putting the B's rear end on the C, and were hoping the different characteristics of the Nürburgring would suit it better. And, yes, we were at the Nurburgring, specifically the Grand-Prix-Strecke, which had been inaugurated for the European Grand Prix in 1984, used for the German Grand Prix in 1985, before being dropped like a hot potato when Hockenheim signed a new exclusive deal. The track hadn't been hugely popular with the drivers, in all honesty, though it had been amended in the meantime. In particular, the final chicane had been redesigned with input from Michael Schumacher. Schumy's popularity was no doubt the reason the race was here, and the ticket sales were very healthy indeed, but Michael's Renault engineer Vincent Gallardeau spoke for most when he said, "Fast corners, a not-so-high average speed, and extremely limited overtaking opportunities. In that respect, it's a second Budapest." It probably didn't help that the circuit bore the name of the legendary Nurburgring, nor that coming straight after the glorious sunshine of Estoril, the weather in the Eifel Mountains of western Germany was distinctly autumnal, some 20 degrees cooler with a stiff wind. So everyone bundled up in their warmest clothes and set out for Friday qualifying, the 40 team still having troubles with their semi-automatic gearbox, which had been in and out of use for the last several months. Here in Germany, Moreno had one and Diniz didn't. The Williams twins had been fastest in all 3 practice sessions, and so it proved in the first qualifying on Friday. Coulthard 2/10 faster than Hill, and Schumacher half a second behind Damon. The weather was very changeable. A quick shower around halfway through the session sent everyone scuttling for the pits, but the sun quickly came out and dried the track, and back out they all went. But by then there were just 10 minutes left in the session, and very few improvements were made. The weather on Saturday continued to be very iffy. The morning warm-up took place in a torrential downpour, but by the time Olivier Panis was the first to take to the track in second qualifying session, the track was more or less dry but covered with damp patches. Panis had gone off with a stuck throttle early on Friday and was keen to try and improve, but pretty much everyone else was waiting for the track to dry further, to the vocal displeasure of the fans at the track, who didn't feel like they'd paid to watch everyone shiver on the pit wall. In fact, Jean-Denis Delatraz probably got the biggest cheer of his career when he ventured out after 20 minutes or so. Eventually the others went out too, but the track just wasn't as quick as it had been the day before, so only 6 drivers improved their times. One of them was Schumacher, but it wasn't enough to get onto the front row, and Coulthard had his 3rd consecutive pole position, with Hill 2nd and Schumacher 3rd. Berger was in his by now customary 4th slot, with his incoming replacement Eddie Irvine doing really well in 5th, ahead of a Lazy, whose bad mood had been compounded by a steering rack problem on Friday. Herbert was 7th alongside the other local hero, Frentzen. The McLaren MP410C, B-ish, still wasn't working, and Mika and Mark had a job just keeping it on the track, lining up 9th and 10th. A miserable-looking Barrichello was down in 11th, alongside his newly announced 1996 teammate Martin Brundle, whose Ligier was likewise having a job just staying on the track. Panis in the end was down in 14th, just behind Bouillon, who had had his best qualifying performance to date. Behind that French pair were the Tyrrell-Minardi footwork group, Salo top of that particular pile, the Minardis again beating the footworks, with Tarquini having a tricky time getting back into an F1 car 3 years on and in difficult track conditions. He did at least beat Inoue and the Pacifics and 40s, with Delatraz once again bringing up the rear, this time a mere 9 seconds off pole and just over 3 off his teammate. After the session there was an evening meeting of the FIA's F1 Commission to decide on the format for 1996. Bernie Ecclestone's proposal was that qualifying should be a single hour's session on the Saturday, with Friday sessions being an additional free practice. Even without that day's session having been a bit of a dud, the motion would probably have passed as it had support from Max Mosley as well, but it can't have hurt. Roger Penske was an unexpected guest at the meeting, Bernie explaining that he wanted to demonstrate good relations between F1 and Indy racing, and then surprised everyone by suggesting that Roger could even be his own successor as head of FOCA. The weather was clearly going to prove decisive in this race, as Sunday dawned wet and foggy, and the morning warm-up was delayed half an hour because he couldn't see the other end of the track, and then when it did take place it was in appalling conditions. Jordan had a new rear wing assembly of some 17 elements in the pursuit of more downforce, while McLaren had once again dug out their airbox mounted mid-wing. Several drivers came a cropper in the slippery conditions, particularly the tight RTL curve. By the time the teams went out onto the grid that afternoon, the rain had stopped, though the weather was still looking very overcast, and it looked like more would be incoming, and the track was at that tricky, a bit too wet for slicks, not really wet enough for wet stage. McLaren and Ferrari bet on it drying quickly and fitted dry tyres, hoping their drivers could keep it on the black bit until it did dry. Pretty much everyone else, though, went on wets. Coulthard slid off on his way round to the grid, and the spare, set up for Damon, was hastily re-stickered and the settings tweaked. Off they went for the parade lap, the lingering mist not improved by the German fans in the stands letting off flares, and as they lined back up on the grid, Max Papis stalled his footwork coming round the last corner, and the marshals inexplicably pushed him right to the front of the grid before Roland Brunschreider cancelled the start, chalked off a lap and sent them back round for another go, with a restarted Papis heading off from the pit lane to start from the back. This time it was Moreno who was unable to get away and would start from the pit lane. Papis meanwhile missed his assigned grid slot and just sort of lined up at the back. He, as well as Barrichello, were suffering from colds and were a bit worried because they'd taken cold remedies which turned out to contain the banned performance-enhancing drug ephedrine, but nothing seems to have come of this, and Max certainly didn't seem to be gaining much of an advantage. Finally, they were ready to start the now 67-lap race, and all the additional faffing about had given the track more chance to dry. Taki Inoue was waving his arms, his electronics having died, but there was no further delay, and off they went. Frentzen visibly moving well before the light, but then stopping again just before the green actually went, as Coulthard got his now customary perfect start, while Hill had his now customary bit of wheel spin and lost second to Schumacher, and then third to a fired-up Irvine. Barrichello had also started well and was looking at Berger, as Hill managed to get back ahead of Irvine at the Vidal chicane coming round to complete the first lap. Coulthard leading Schumacher by half a second, then a gap of just under 4 seconds back to Hill and Irvine, with Herbert and Alesi rounding out the top 6, Barrichello having stormed past both Berger and Frentzen to put himself 7th. The two teams who had started on slicks were having very differing fortunes. The Ferraris were 6th and 9th, Berger suffering but still staying in touch, while the McLarens were really dropping back. They were 15th and 16th on lap 2. At the end of that lap, Coulthard still had Schumacher tucked up under his rear wing, and Hill was now closing on the pair of them, but the track was already dry enough on the racing line that the drivers were moving over to find damp bits to cool their tyres on, and Alesi had gained enough confidence to be attacking Herbert. But some parts of the track were wetter than others, and slick-shod Alesi was still running slower than the front runners on their wet tyres. Frentzen was given a 10-second penalty for his pretty obvious jump start, as Hill joined the back of the Coulthard-Schumacher battle. By lap 7, as Alesi pulled out and took 5th off Herbert at the first turn, the only cars behind the two McLarens were Delatraz and the delayed Moreno. Meanwhile, at the front, Schumacher had had to stop attacking Coulthard and start defending against Hill, who was hopping around behind him. David was thus able to pull away a bit as Frentzen came into the sin bin. Hill was putting pressure on Schumacher, who closed the door firmly, but the Williams was clearly quicker, and it was surely just a matter of time. Meanwhile, Alesi might have been running a second slower on his slick tyres than the leading pack on their wets, but he'd now caught Irvine and passed him for 4th on lap 9. Barrichello was the first man to go to slicks on the same lap, but a very long stop for an additional fuel load put him back well down the order. The leaders were already lapping Moreno at the end of lap 10, and the 40 had held up Coulthard enough to bunch them up again, as well as allowing Alesi to set the fastest lap. Was that just because Coulthard had been held up, or did that mean that now was the optimal time to switch tyres? The team seemed to think the latter, and in came Schumacher and Hill the next time around. Once again, the Benetton stop was nearly 3 seconds quicker than the Williams one, putting Hill back out behind both Herbert and Berger, with Schumacher behind his teammate. Next time round it was Coulthard, an almost identical time to Hill's stop, which put Alesi and Irvine up into the top 2 places, with David rejoining 3rd, then Herbert peeled in out of Schumacher's way. The German promptly attached himself to Coulthard's rear wing, while Hill was being held up by Berger, doggedly sticking to his line despite intermittent engine cutouts. Papis was given a 10-second penalty for not lining up properly on the grid, as Coulthard, Schumacher, Berger and Hill all closed in on Eddie Irvine, who was still on wets but didn't seem in any hurry to change or to get out of Coulthard's way, all of which was music to Jean Alesi's ears as he sailed off into the distance and set a series of fastest laps. Hill finally got past Berger on lap 14, only to be held up by Delatraz, and then Irvine finally pitted just as Panis spun out at the Shell curve. Battle had been rejoined between Hill and Schumacher, and at the RTL curve, Hill dived inside, going wheel-to-wheel with the Benetton all the way through the corner before going round the outside at the next one to take the place. Up front, Alesi was lapping Mark Blundell, who was getting going again on slick tyres and spun into retirement in the attempt to get out of the way, and while the cameras were watching that, Schumacher retook 3rd as they passed the pits, so Hill had another look at RTL as they came around, but Schumacher chopped across, Hill stamped on the brake and very nearly hit the back of Schumacher. The lightest of contact was made. Whatever was ailing Berger's engine, meanwhile, seemed to have sorted itself out, and he was sticking with the pair of them as they made their way past Montemini. Frentzen retired from 7th and would be having some words with Pedro Diniz after the race, by which time Alesi had a solid 23-second lead and was continuing to lap faster and faster, leaving second-place Coulthard further behind at the rate of some 2 seconds a lap. But the TV director understandably only had eyes for the scrap between Hill and Schumacher, with Berger lurking in the background, waiting for Hill to repeat his previous indiscretions and take both of them out. The three approached 14th placed Häkkinen, having a pretty miserable 27th birthday weekend, but although Mika moved well over for his future teammate, Coulthard was suffering severe oversteer in his Williams and just couldn't get past. But Schumacher could, taking advantage of the delay to nick second place. Häkkinen moved over again to let both Williamses through, successfully this time, but Coulthard was now fighting Hill hard for position on the track as Schumacher pulled away from the pair of them. Finally, Hill got past Coulthard while the cameras were elsewhere, as the Ferrari mechanics started setting out the tyres. It was coming up on 2/3 distance, and now Berger was swarming all over the back of the number 6 Williams, as Alesi continued setting fastest laps, his lead now 35 seconds. Berger got past Coulthard at the RTL Kurve, only to go straight into the pits at the end of the lap, an 11-second stop putting him out just in front of 6th-placed Irvine, and the Austrian was able to keep his replacement at bay until his tyres were up to temperature. Schumacher and Hill were making their way through traffic as Alesi continued setting fastest laps as his fuel load got lighter and lighter, and it was starting to look like he was only going to make a single stop and would at this rate have time for an oil change and a quick glass of wine and still get out into the lead. He was just lapping Montemini for the second time and approaching a little group of Irvine, Herbert and Barrichello in 6th through 8th places to lap them for the first time. It was Hill's turn then to go fastest on laps 29 and 30 as Alesi was balked lapping Herbert, eliciting the traditional Alesi fist wave, this time mid-chicane. Hill's fast laps had got him back under Schumacher's rear wing, as the defending champion was held up momentarily by that man Max Papis and had to take to a damp patch to get past, while up ahead of them Herbert had misjudged a move on Irvine at the Ford Kurve and made contact, fortunately gently enough that they both kept running, but bounced through the gravel and let Barrichello through, and Johnny would have to make a slightly earlier than planned second stop to get a new nose, which took nearly a minute and put him back out behind his old Lotus teammate Häkkinen. Finally, on lap 34 of the 67, Alesi peeled in for what was undoubtedly his only pit stop, a trouble-free 15 seconds, and he left just as Schumacher came in. The Benetton crew did a greased lightning 7.7 seconds, but that was because they'd decided to put in a light fuel load and make an extra stop, in a bid to take advantage of what would now be a fuel-heavy Ferrari. Williams, meanwhile, was sticking with their planned strategy, so Hill and Coulthard were staying out for the time being. Hill now just 5 seconds behind Alesi, but he would need to make another stop in a few laps' time. He was charging on light tanks and was soon right behind the Ferrari, while Schumacher was the fastest man on the track and chasing down Coulthard, who was also expecting to stop soon, and did on lap 39, emerging behind Berger. As Coulthard was making his way out of the pits, Hill had another go at Alesi at RTL as they both came up to lap Tarquini. The Ferrari moved across and, crunch, the Williams' nose was askew and shed its front wing a couple of corners later. An absolute disaster for Damon, who tiptoed cautiously round to the pits for a new nose. To the credit of the Williams team, they were much faster replacing it than Benetton had been replacing Johnny's, but it was still a 32-second stop, allowing Schumacher to sail past into second. As Hill was leaving, Berger was arriving from fourth, but his engine's electrics died and would not be resurrected, so he was out. So on lap 43, Alesi now led Schumacher by 14 seconds, with Coulthard a very distant third, over 30 seconds behind the German, with Hill 9 seconds behind his teammate in fourth, followed by Barrichello, Herbert, Irvine and Brundle. Montemini made his stop from 14th, but the lollipop went up and the front jack went down, while the malfunctioning fuel hose was still attached, and mechanic Paul Summerfield was mown down by Andrea's left rear. The medical crew were on the scene and Summerfield was taken off to the medical centre and thence to Bonn Hospital with a broken leg. No fuel had actually gone into the car either, so Montemini ran dry a few laps later. An unseen collision between Bouillon and Sarlo put the Frenchman out and sent the Finn back to the pits with a puncture, but with Schumacher still lapping fastest, Alesi's lead had by then been cut to just over 6 seconds, and then when Alesi was held up by traffic it was down to 4. Both passed Delatraz, who seemed to suffer a grand mal seizure at the wheel, and Schumacher continued setting fastest laps as he drew up on the rear of Alesi, who was in turn about to lap Häkkinen, whose start-on-slicks, do-one-stop strategy had been rather less successful than Jean's. But still, Schumacher had one more stop to make, and on lap 52, as Alesi got on the tail of Häkkinen and the Tyrrells, he made it. 7.5 seconds stationary with a fresh set of boots, and off he went, rejoining 20 seconds behind Alesi, but still a good 20 ahead of Coulthard, with Hill still another 6 seconds behind his teammate. On fresh tyres and with 14 laps to go, Schumacher put his foot down and set off in pursuit of Alesi and the win. Though in terms of the championship, he could just relax and finish second, which would add 3 points to the gap between himself and Hill as things stood, making it a very difficult 20 with 3 races left. Roared on by his home fans, though, he wanted to be on that top step and was reeling in Alesi once more. Fastest lap after fastest lap, but with 10 to go, Schumacher was still 13 seconds behind and still needed to then get past Alesi, who would not want to give up that second win. Further back, Hill was reducing the deficit to Coulthard, the Scot still fighting the handling of his Williams, as Damon determined to get that one extra point that overtaking him would mean. He was over 3 seconds behind and pushing hard now, too hard, as on lap 59 he ran a little wide at RTL, put his right rear on the wet curb and went spearing off into the tyre wall to the cheers and jeers of the German fans in the stands right next to him. If things stayed as they were, then that meant Hill would have an almost insurmountable 23-point deficit to overcome in the remaining 3 races, but Schumacher was determined that things wouldn't stay as they were and was still flying in pursuit of Alesi. He'd now got the deficit down to 6.7 seconds as Alesi was held up by Hakkinen and Brundle. Passing the Finn, Jean turned his attentions to Martin, with whom he'd had a number of tussles so far this season. Coming into the Vidal chicane, he had a look, changed his mind, but had ended up offline and then ran wide, bumping across the grass, not doing any damage but losing precious tenths and meaning he'd have to scrub the dirt off his tyres, and then lap Hakkinen and Brundle again, the pair fighting over 7th place and not particularly keen to disadvantage themselves letting the leaders through. So with 5 laps to go, Alesi had Schumacher right on his tail, with Coulthard still holding on to 3rd and the last man unlapped. Barrichello and Irvine were 4th and 5th for Jordan, which would lift the Irish team above Sauber into 4th place, and in 6th place was Johnny Herbert. Alesi was never an easy man to pass, but his tyres were heavily worn, unlike Schumacher's, and it would be a major feat of driving to stay in the lead all the way, with the Benetton stuck to his rear wing and pressuring him. Brundle and Hakkinen lapped Badoer, and then Alesi and Schumacher forced their way past too, Michael looking for a way through but not finding it. But races could turn on the tiniest of things. Alesi locked his right front under braking for the chicane, and Schumacher pounced. But again Alesi slammed the door. Up ahead, Diniz was about to be lapped by Hakkinen and Brundle, and the leader's job was made somewhat easier when both Pedro and Mika went sliding off at the bit cover. And then as they came down to the Vidal chicane, Schumacher pulled out to the right and braked very, very late, forcing Alesi to clatter across the inside curb, held on as the pair came inches from collision and emerged in the lead with 2 laps to go. On shot tyres there was no way Alesi could stay with Schumacher as the German disappeared off to take his 7th win of the year and his 2nd in front of his adoring home fans, with Alesi 2nd, his first podium since Silverstone, but still left wondering what might have been, and Coulthard rewarded with 3rd place and 4 points after an unglamorous but dogged drive. Barrichello took 4th, but Herbert had passed Irvine on the penultimate lap to nab the 2 points. Brundle and Hakkinen were 7th and 8th, with 15 finishers, the last of whom was birthday boy Jean-Denis Delatraz, celebrating with his first career finish a mere 7 laps down. And Damon Hill? He'd been hustled away from his wrecked Williams by the marshals, but re-emerged onto the trackside to applaud Schumacher on his slowing down lap. Schumacher slowed to acknowledge him. In fact, he said later he'd tried to stop and pick him up, which would have been a fantastic photo opportunity, but his clutch was misbehaving and he had no desire to be towed home like he was at Hockenheim, so Damon would have to walk. Celebrations for Schumacher and Benetton, who had both as good as won their titles here. Certainly Schumacher now led Hill by 27 points, with a maximum of 30 left up for grabs. Damon would need to win all 3 races and hope Schumacher scored no more than 2 points, while Schumacher only needed 3 more points at Aida to take the title. Herbert's overtake of Irvine meant that Jordan only equalled rather than overhauled Sauber in the constructors' standings, but both were now just 3 points behind McLaren after their 2nd consecutive pointless race. After a quick dash across half a continent between these 2 races, the teams now had a 3-week gap to get everything ready for the final 3 races, beginning with a double-header in Japan, 2 races a week apart at Aida and then Suzuka.